Good afternoon. My name is Nora Gay, and I'm the president of the ACS Student Chapter at the University of Texas School of Law. And I want to thank you all for being here. This has already been such a great convention, and there's still more great things to come for the rest of the day. Our afternoon keynote, Debo Adegbile, has a rich history advocating for civil rights and against discrimination. Debo served as acting president and director counsel for the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, where he defended civil rights for 12 years. Debo also served as LDF's director of litigation and director of the Voting Rights Group. And during his time at LDF, he argued before the Supreme Court for two major cases defending the constitutionality of key provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 in Shelby County v. Holder in 2013, and closer to home to us here in Austin, in Northwest Austin Municipal Utility District Number 1 versus Holder in 2009. Some of you may remember that President Barack Obama nominated Debo to serve as Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights for the Department of Justice in November of 2013. But his nomination was narrowly blocked in the Senate because of his role in helping to appeal the unconstitutional death sentence of former Black Panther Mumia Abu-Jamal. President Obama characterized the Senate's failure to nominate Debo as a travesty based on wildly unfair character attacks against a good and qualified public servant. A partner at WilmerHale, Debo was named to the board of directors for ACS last year, and we are so pleased to have him here to speak to us this afternoon. Please join me in welcoming Debo Adegbile.
Good afternoon. Thank you for that warm introduction and warm welcome. It's nice to be back in Austin, Texas. As you heard, the last time I was here, we were actually celebrating what we considered a victory in the Northwest Austin voting case with our clients. We came and we broke bread and had some barbecue, and we knew that the road ahead would be long and winding, but we enjoyed the victory for that moment. I begin with a piece of advice today, and it's sometimes annoying to get advice from speakers, but I'll start there in any event, and we'll see how it goes. And my advice is that it really is an unexpected privilege to be with you today. As you heard, I had contemplated being somewhere else at this moment, but sometimes careers follow winding paths, and mine did. And one of my pieces of advice to all of you is to embrace the winding road that you may find. One door closes, another opens, and sometimes there are blessings in disguise. And so my particular blessings in disguise are to be able to serve with many bright and able lawyers at WilmerHale, to serve on the board of ACS, and to be with you today to talk a little bit about things that matter a great deal, I think, to all of us. And so we come to the moment at which the president and the country's eyes will be fixed anew on Selma, Alabama. Today is the 50th anniversary, as we all know, and I guess I've given advice, and now I give you thanks. I expected many of you to perhaps be watching that speech and maybe have a more intimate gathering here, but thank you for joining me, and perhaps we'll catch that later. That march, as you know, in Alabama 50 years ago was conceived as a nonviolent march intended to illustrate to the world that some of the promises we make really matter. It came to be known as Bloody Sunday because the marchers, as they crossed the bridge, were met by police and state troopers on the other side of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, carrying gas masks, billy clubs, riot helmets, wearing riot helmets. Some were on horseback. When the marchers reached the other side, the beating ensued. And what's so extraordinary about it is that those marchers knew that there was a high chance that there would be violence. They actually knew that there might be violence. They knew that because that was Sheriff Jim Clark's way. But they could not have known the severity of the beating that they would face. One professor, Barbara Harris Combs, has written about it, and she described the row of state troopers that met the marchers as having been assembled with military precision. The marchers were Americans. They were men, women, and children. They were categorically excluded from the ballot because of their race. They sought nothing more than rights that the Constitution guarantees to all of us. And as I've said, they were beaten mercilessly before the eyes of the country and the world, as the TV cameras were there to record it all. I consider them American heroes, and I personally have drawn a lot of inspiration from the sacrifices that they made. I recommend to all of you a certain segment of the Eyes on the Prize series. The segment is called Bridge to Freedom, and it's the part that covers the movement for voting rights in Alabama. If you've not seen it, I assure you it will leave an impact on you, because it's not just the march, it's everything that led up to it. And if you have seen it, then you know that I'm speaking the truth. But Bloody Sunday left us with something. It was a gift. It was a transformative moment for the nation. Many of the people there were no older than you, some were younger. And so on this day, we pause to remember the events in Selma, Alabama. If we don't pause right now, perhaps we pause later in the day, but we should pause to remember the events, because the marchers in Selma didn't march for themselves, they marched for all of us. And so on this date, we're reminded that even in free societies, sometimes the road to progress is winding and difficult and involves a certain amount of personal risk. Where does this date fit in the bigger picture and the topic that I want to come to today? Well, to my mind, Selma also gives us a lens on something that's important in the United States of America. It's important to reflect, and many public officials have done so recently, that law enforcement has played a role, sometimes positive, sometimes negative, in guarding our liberties. Selma, to be sure, was a democracy moment, but it was also a law enforcement story. And so on this day of commemoration, while the President and the citizens are assembled in Selma, I begin here because properly conceived, law enforcement serves democratic goals. And as Police Commissioner Bratton of New York suggested recently, moments from our history, a lot like Selma, though he didn't mention that one in particular, are part of the difficult history of policing in America. If we have in our mind's eye the image on the bridge and some of the images in Ferguson, there are aspects of those two pictures that you can juxtapose, and they bear a certain similarity. In the words of the just released report from the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, it begins this way: trust between law enforcement agencies and the people they protect and serve is essential in a democracy. And so we take it to the beginning of the country, as we are fond of doing as lawyers. We always go back there. Some important things happened at that time. And it's fair to say that at the founding, law enforcement was really considered to be the role and duty of every citizen, right? There were militias, there were individuals that had to jump and protect themselves and family and property at a moment's notice. Police forces, as we now know them, did not exist. Armies did, but the question of whether to maintain a standing army amongst the citizens during peacetime aroused a degree of suspicion. This is the history. Having lived with an occupying force for a long time, the founding generation had some idea about what that felt like and some suspicion about it, as I've said. They worried about the impact that such a force would have on notions of liberty and what we now call civil rights. And it's fair to say that the Declaration of Independence itself notes as one of the particular grievances the standing armies that lived among the colonists. But to say that policing was not a concept familiar to the founding generation is not to say that it didn't come to be firmly rooted within our democratic traditions. In the following century, American democracy expanded to accommodate millions who had been denied fundamental and civil and political rights. The nation was once again transformed, and the Union grew and moved. Following the Civil War, we recognize the basic principles of human dignity that the Constitution as drafted didn't accord to all of the people. As Thurgood Marshall put it on the occasion of the bicentennial of the Constitution, while the Union survived the Civil War, the Constitution did not. In its place arose a new, more promising basis for justice and equality. Now, of course, we know the Constitution in fact survived. I think what he was pointing to was the change, and the change for the better, and the way in which the document that emerged on the other side was actually more in line with the ideals that had motivated it than the document as drafted initially. But it showed the process, it showed that through that process, through the process encompassed in the Constitution, we could improve, we could become better, we could reach toward the ideal of making the Union more perfect. As this evolution was happening, there was something else happening, which was this idea of formal police departments. In the 1800s, it began with police departments in London and soon to follow in New York. And while the conversation was happening, with the same type of suspicion about having a type of standing army or a militia in peacetime, there were these principles that were announced in London that were designed to speak to the tensions of how you negotiate living in a free society while at the same time protecting liberty and equality through an armed group of individuals. These principles that came to be known as Peel's principles are worth reflecting on now, because although they come from 1829 in England, I think if we stack them up against some of the conversations and some of the conversations that I'm sure you all have been having, certainly that the nation is having, I think they have something to tell us about this important undertaking. So the first of the principles, for example, committed that the British Police Department would prevent crime and disorder as an alternative to their repression by military force and severity of legal punishment. This was a liberty principle, as I think about it. The second principle states the ability of the police to perform their duties is dependent upon public approval of police existence, actions, behavior, and the ability of the police to secure and maintain public respect. I think of this as a police legitimacy principle. But perhaps the most important of these Peelian principles, of Sir Richard Peel's principles, was the one that we should consider integral to the very idea of policing. It's the principle that reminds us that the historic tradition that the police are the public and the public are the police. I think of this as the community principle. It's a principle that binds those who agree to serve and protect to those who would be served and protected. At the same time, it reminds the citizens that they too have a duty of care and a role to play in community safety. In the broader tradition of American policing, we have essentially embraced many of these core principles as the years wound on in the 1800s. In effect, these democratic guideposts form the backdrop of that task force report, the recent presidential task force report that I mentioned. And that report, as I said, released just this week, states that trust between law enforcement and the people they protect and serve is essential to democracy. That, in essence, is the bargain. That's the deal we've struck. Where there is trust on both sides, the community benefits from public servants who are interested in its well-being and understand the weight of their responsibility. Police, in turn, benefit from working in communities that see them as necessary and as a way to solve problems. So this in no way should be surprising. We have known that effective policing is democracy enforcing, not anti-democratic. Effective policing is consistent with civil rights, not a threat to them. It is committed to the rule of law and to the rights of the general public, the entire public, and to the accused. It derives its legitimacy from a mutual respect, and for decades, communities have embraced these principles. And so, more specifically, what is this community idea? What is this community policing that we hear so much about in the reports and the conversations and from the experts? DOJ has one definition that captured my imagination. It says, community policing is democracy in action. Community policing is democracy in action. It requires the active participation of local government, civic and business leaders, public and private agencies, residents, churches, though here I might substitute houses of worship, schools, and hospitals, all who bear responsibility for safeguarding a neighborhood and should bear responsibility for safeguarding that welfare. This is the DOJ definition. As you can see, this formulation is hearkening back to the Peelian principles, right? They're not, there's not a tension between those two sets of ideas. At times, these core principles in community policing, however, have given way to other, more detached tactics. One scholar has described the phenomenon as a we-they model. Then in the 1960s, and perhaps more so in the 80s and 90s, the community policing idea gains greater currency. And so I come to an early example, which was the case study out of Washington, D.C. In the late 60s, not long after Bloody Sunday, in the nation's capital, it was a sort of laboratory for this community policing idea. Tensions were high. Assassinations were happening, capturing the heart of the nation. Racial tension, strife, civil unrest. War was raging on. And at that time, in 1969, 3 out of 4 Metro officers were white, though 7 out of 10 police officers were African American. A year earlier, in 1968, the New York Times observed that the unwillingness to cooperate with the police of residents in D.C. was similar to the relationship between Vietnamese citizens and American soldiers half a world away. It speaks to the tension, to this idea of the dichotomy between a community force and a sense of an occupying force, whether real or perceived. So the department did something about it. It turned to the community, it listened to the concerns, it recruited from the community, it embraced college graduates instead of pushing them away, it scaled back on aggressive and flashy policing tactics and diverted its resources to local community policing. The neighborhood patrols were important and were part of the problem solving. What happened? What was the yield? Well, first, as Police Chief Jerry Wilson explained, he said, the use of violence is not the job of police officers. FBI-sourced crime data indicate that in D.C., citywide crime dropped by 25%, property damage by 28%. There is no doubt that statistics like these are hard to attribute to a single cause, right? That there's a big discussion in the literature as crime goes down. What are the causal factors, all the reasons why it happens? But by all accounts, the community policing in D.C. became a part of law enforcement, and all must agree that it was a welcome result. A similar success happened in the 80s in Houston, experimenting with a two-phased approach that enabled both community and law enforcement. They reaped the following results: greater citizen support, shared responsibility, greater job satisfaction amongst the police officers themselves, and increased support for organizational change. So before we move to conversations about some of the issues that have been debated today and witnessed today, I think we need to take a moment to think a little bit about what are some of the realities that police officers face. Law enforcement is difficult, and we ask a great deal of those who protect us. There are challenges both old and new that we ask brave people to step into the breach and to assert themselves, to stand between violence and danger and us. Still, even as things improve and crime improves, we recognize that police officers do their job in a world where there are too many illegal guns on the streets, sometimes guns in the hands of children, mentally ill persons without adequate care, sometimes with guns or weapons, terror threats, cyber threats, and the list continues. By any fair account, it's a dangerous and stressful job, and the job sometimes involves split-second, life and death decisions, snap judgments that are perhaps easy to revisit in the cool light of day. But we ask the police to do their jobs and to step into the breach, and to do so even where budgets are cut, training is cut, sometimes equipment is inadequate. But here is the point, and I can't stress this enough. The choice that we are making and the conversation that we're having in the country is not between having police and not having police. In the communities across the nation, we're not looking to demonize citizens, nor are we looking to demonize police. We're looking for a more rational assessment of how we proceed. And so the President's report explains decades of research and practice tell us that the public cares much more about how the police interact with them as they care about the outcomes and legal actions that are produced. People are more likely to obey the law, it continues, when they believe that those who are enforcing it have the right, the legitimate authority to tell them what to do. Disadvantaged communities, including immigrant communities here in Texas and elsewhere, are also often communities that want and need law enforcement, desperately so, but they also want their human dignity. I know this from firsthand experience. I grew up in a community where I was very, very, very happy that there was law enforcement. I grew up in a section of the Bronx, New York, where crime was a common occurrence. There were drugs, there was violence. While I was in high school, a young person my age at the time, but attended a different school, was murdered, as I recall it, in a candy store not too far away. There are a lot of people like me. There are a lot of people that live in these communities. And so the point is not to say that the police should go away and should stop protecting the citizens. But the point is to think about how we can realign it and bring it a little bit closer to the democratic principles that we all value, to the liberty principles. And so part of what we need is a sustained national conversation. Recent events have pushed it to the front burner, but we need the conversation to be sustained if there's going to be progress. There's no question that the conversation has been marked by a fair amount of discord of late. We began today with images of Selma, which is an example of the misuse of police authority, a use that was democracy undermining and not reinforcing. But through Selma, we moved on to a different path, albeit a long and winding path, and it continues to wind today, but it was an important moment and an inflection point. 50 years later, we may be at a different inflection point. There are no guarantees, but there are some signs, where by many accounts and experiences, policing in too many places has swung away from some of the principles of which I spoke and that we all embrace. Several recent killings of unarmed or mentally ill individuals by law enforcement, however, illustrate some of the imbalance. You know the names: Eric Garner in Staten Island, Tamir Rice in Cleveland, Akai Gurley in Brooklyn, James Boyd in Albuquerque, Michael Brown in St. Louis. All of these events are harrowing. They hurt the community, they hurt the nation, they hurt the police. But we can't stop with an individual incident, as important as they all are. And that's part of the conversation that was engendered this week, to think more broadly about how we get to these moments. Take the recent consent decrees that the Department of Justice has issued in a number of different places, right? It's not just the places I've named, though they're included. There have been consent decrees among other places in Cleveland, Albuquerque, Canton, Alabama, Newark, and elsewhere. And of course, the recent report about Ferguson. One of the things that we've all noted about Ferguson, and that I think people find illuminating, if not disappointing, is that it seems that one of the core principles of the use of law enforcement in Ferguson has been a revenue generation principle. It's not clear that that makes the community safer. It is clear that it's been focused and targeted on the African American community, and that it has been focused on people very often of limited means. I wonder if we were to step away from those facts and just ask Would that approach in any community make the neighborhood safer? How many people would raise their hand and say yes? But there's another point that I think I want to raise today and think a little bit about. And that is that some of the policies that we're talking about, and I hope that this conversation gets pushed and continued, is that the police officers are often the front line. That is to say, they're often enforcing policies and practices that they don't set. And I think there's some evidence, and I take it more facts will come to be known, but the DOJ report points to a fair amount of evidence that it was a way of doing business in Ferguson, that the revenue-generating principle was not just something that was decided by the officers themselves, but was a very complicated system that decided to proceed in this way. Now, this is not to say that unconstitutional actions taken by a law enforcement officer get a free pass, but it is to acknowledge that the questions are complicated and multifaceted. Some of you may have had a chance to look at some of the stats, but when you hear them again, they really stand out. Black people in Ferguson accounted for 93% of all the arrests between 2012 and 2014, but make up only 67% of the population. And once they were stopped, drivers were twice as likely to be searched, even though searches of white drivers were more likely to turn up contraband. And hearkening back to the reviled tactics of an uglier time that seems more akin to Selma than what we would expect today, every person upon whom the police deployed attack dogs was African American. In his press conference this week, the Attorney General made particular note of an incredibly vague and malleable Ferguson municipal infraction called manner of walking on a roadway. 95% of those charged with that infraction between 2011 and 2013 were African American. Accordingly, community members had taken to calling the charge walking black. And so even before the complicated facts of the Michael Brown killing in Ferguson are examined and the contested eyewitness testimony, it's fair to ask the question, to the extent that the early story was that Michael Brown was come upon because he was essentially walking on a roadway, as I understand it. So in that context, when you know this is the practice, you have to ask the question about how it came to happen in the first place. That's not to tell the story or answer the question about what happened in the fateful moments. But it is a fair question to ask about whether that encounter should have happened at all. In this and too many other high-profile cases, we've also grown accustomed to hearing language of the so-called super predator. Perhaps some of you have heard this term, super predator. This is the idea that young and aggressive Black or Latino alleged perpetrators must be stopped at all costs. It came into the parlance not just from a newspaper columnist looking for a headline, but there was a professor who coined this term. You may not be surprised, or perhaps you are surprised, that he recently renounced his coining of the term, super predator, in an amicus brief to the Supreme Court in a case that involved juvenile sentences. He filed a brief on the same side as the Legal Defense Fund, and he said that his purpose was to invalidate the super predator myth, a myth he helped to create, and an environment that he helped to contribute to. To be short, was embraced by political leaders, Black and white, and Latino. But language matters in law enforcement. The point is that language matters in law enforcement. And when we use these terms, and we use this language, and we use it on a daily basis, whether it's in courts or in interactions with individuals, it erodes some of the respect, some of that feeling that we are one. It is a we or they framework which contributes to harmful interactions. While I was the lit director at LDF, we litigated a case that involved what we called vertical sweeps. Vertical sweeps were patrols in public housing where police would go through these large buildings and complexes and look for people that were committing illegal trespasses. That was the idea, in theory, to keep the people in public housing safe. But the way that the practice played out is that people were frequently arrested for not having identification on their person without regard to whether they were in their home, in the home of a family member, a parent, a friend. And these arrests can have carry-on effects for people with jobs, people with families. Nobody wants to go to jail because they forgot their wallet upstairs or don't have identification. And so these public housing sweeps were in my mind when I heard about Akai Gurley in New York being shot because he chose to walk down the stairs in a public housing development. That case would go on to be settled, I think, close in time to the shooting of Akai Gurley. But the settlement, the favorable settlement on behalf of our clients, was not early enough. How can it be that in a free society, a choice to walk down the stairs in your building is a fateful choice that leads to a life having been ended in a dark stairwell? I learned something when I litigated that case, and it brings me back to something I knew from my own experience that I've relayed to you. And that is, one of the plaintiffs in the case was a woman whose name I believe is Eleanor Burt. Miss Burt, and you can read about her comments in the case, you can Google them and see them for yourself, but Miss Burt came to be involved in the case because her son, who I believe was a recent college graduate, was arrested and taken to jail because he didn't have his identification. He was a person with a job, he was walking in the building. I can't remember if he lived there with his grandmother or if he was visiting her, but he was arrested, and it had some ramifications for his own employment. And Mrs. Burt very clearly said to us, and I believe she said it in the press, she said, there are things that we want in public housing. We want the doors to be fixed, we want the cameras to work, we want the police to come here, but we want to be treated with respect and dignity. And those two things are not dichotomous, they're not in tension. Both of those things can be done. That was what Miss Burt wanted. She made it clear to her lawyers. She wasn't looking to take the police away from the neighborhood, but just engage on a different level and in a different way. And part of this democratic gap that we have with police is about the growth in militarization of police departments. I think it was Winston Churchill who said that in a democracy, when the doorbell rings in the early hours, it's more likely to be the milkman than anybody else. But a 2014 ACLU report released a study of SWAT team deployments across the country and found that 65% of SWAT team deployments resulted in some sort of forced entry into a private home by way of battering ram or some sort of explosive. But in over half of those raids, the police failed to find any sort of weapon, which was cited as the reason for the SWAT team deployment. And so, although it may never have happened to us, we have to think about those families who, as they sleep with their kids and their family, with their lives going on, what it's like to be on the other side of that very frightening experience. Frankly, we have to think about what it's like for the SWAT officers who are breaking in on people that have committed no crime in the middle of the night. There's something that needs to be revisited if that's the way we're proceeding. There's another one that's not talked about as much, but that you should be aware of, and I encourage you to read about it. And that's the dramatic expansion of civil asset forfeitures. These forfeitures provide very substantial funding for police departments. There are certain programs, some of them are done in conjunction with the federal government, whereby police can seize the proceeds of property that they believe to have been involved in a crime. What's extraordinary about it is that if you look, it's been expanding very dramatically, and some of the stories about the nature in which property is being seized really create some pause. It's another piece of the policing for profit motive, and I should note that there are legitimate reasons to use asset forfeiture. But the way in which it's expanding and perhaps unchecked is a problem. We have to think about the fact that in a system where we allow asset forfeitures where no person has been convicted of a crime, but to take somebody's property, we push the balance and the burden of recovering the property onto the individual who has the seized property. Very often they don't have the means to go through the legal process to get it back. Because the police departments very often can share the proceeds of the seized property, it creates a weird and perverse incentive. And in one Philadelphia case that's been reported in the newspapers, the police seized the home of a Greek immigrant family because their son was caught selling $40 worth of drugs outside of the property. Now think about that. Crime is crime, but this to me sounds ridiculous. To take somebody's home because $40 worth of drugs were sold outside, it doesn't seem to enforce democracy, sound policing, respect for law enforcement, or to do any of the things that the principles suggest that we should be doing. Here in Texas, the ACLU settled a class action suit with law enforcement officials in Tanajá and Shelby County, where police seized $3 million between 2006 and 2008 in at least 148 cases by pulling over motorists without justification and asking if they were carrying cash. According to the ACLU, almost all of the stops involved Black and Latino drivers, and none of the plaintiffs in the case were ever arrested or charged with a crime. We could speak at some length with more time, which we don't have, about felon disfranchisement also, but suffice it to say, that is a carry-on effect. That is a democracy distorting effect of some of these practices. And so, I'm an optimist. I believe that tomorrow can be better than today. And I think that there are some indications that we may well be at an inflection point. Lawyers, law students, and many others, not just the DOJ, have engaged in important cases and litigation to help bridge the gap. The Center for Constitutional Rights has had important cases in the area of stop and frisk. My former organization, the Legal Defense Fund, as I mentioned, has worked on those public housing sweeps. The ACLU, Institute for Justice, and Americans for Tax Reform in the area of asset forfeiture, and these are just a few. Another organization that does very good work in both the policy and in the innovative models space in criminal justice is the Vera Institute for Justice, with which I am affiliated. They focus on data to prove better ways to proceed. Some have argued that in order to make these changes or to implement these settlements or verdicts, that we risk making people less safe, that people will be in harm's way. But I think a fair reading of some of the changes in New York and other places is that we have not seen a meaningful decrease since stop and frisk has been altered. We've not seen the parade of horribles that some suggested would come as the cases were litigated and before the new mayor took a different path. That's not in evidence. There are some fluctuations, to be sure, but we were told that people needed to be stopped at this exorbitant rate in these neighborhoods over and over again and go to jail, very often having committed no crime, because that was what was necessary for safety, and that's just not what we're seeing on the other side. Law enforcement itself is an important part of the justice reform issue, and I think that there was a really important speech that the FBI Director James Comey gave a week or two ago, maybe it's 2 weeks ago now, at Georgetown. In that speech, he praised the work of the majority of law enforcement officials across the country, but he acknowledged some hard truths about the history of policing in the United States, saying, at many points in American history, law enforcement enforced the status quo, a status quo that was often brutally unfair to disfavored groups. Sometimes when you talk about law enforcement in America, it comes back to the story of the Irish in America. And so I'll pause here for 1 second. Apparently, Comey gave this speech in Healy Hall, and I didn't know much about Mr. Healy, Mr. Patrick Healy, for whom the hall is named at Georgetown. But in reading up on the speech and learning about it, I came to learn that Patrick Healy was half Irish and half black, and the first person of African descent to hold a PhD and become the president of a predominantly white college in America. And so I tip my hat to Mr. Healy for his achievements and for the black Irish who care about criminal justice reform all over the world. You can see me afterward if we need to start a society. But there was a joke when Barack Obama was running for president the first time. He took a trip to Ireland, and somebody coined a song that said, "There's nobody more Irish than Barack Obama." And the song was enjoyed by people in my house. Of course, I raised my hand to say, actually, I'm more Irish than Barack Obama. Going on and back to the FBI director's speech, he recognized that deep-seated distrust has become calcified, and in many communities, some folks in law enforcement assume, and I'm quoting here, that everybody is lying, that no suspect, regardless of race, could be innocent, while at the same time, members of the community distrust even the best officers, asserting that people view the police not as allies, but as antagonists, and think of them not with respect or gratitude, but with suspicion and distrust. This is the cycle that we're trying to break and that we contemplated so many years ago. To me, this is not a trust deficit. This is actually a democracy deficit. It's a bigger issue in our society. And so FBI Director Comey, and not only do we share a love of this black-Irish criminal justice connection, but we're also about the same height, give or take a foot. But FBI Director Comey went on to say, those of us in law enforcement must redouble our efforts to resist bias and prejudice. We must better understand the people we serve and protect by trying to know deep in our gut what it feels like to be a law-abiding young black man walking on the street and encountering law enforcement. We must understand how that young man may see us. We must resist the lazy shortcuts of cynicism and approach him with respect and decency. When I heard that, it made me smile because, in a sense, the FBI director is saying the very same thing that my client at LDF, Mrs. Eleanor Britt, was saying about her experiences and what her hope and aspiration was for law enforcement. But Comey was not alone. Bill Bratton weighed in and had his own diagnosis. In his remarks, he said, many of the worst parts of black history would not have been possible, or actually he said would have been impossible without police. He said, he continued, slavery, our country's original sin, sat on a foundation codified by laws and enforced by police, by slave catchers. But he too is hopeful that this generation could bend the arc. We cannot change the past, but working together we can change the future. And there's a lot of this conversation and some parsing that's happened, and I've seen it a little bit about some of the DOJ reports, to talk about what we experience today is intentional discrimination, racial animus, akin to what Sheriff Clark and others practiced on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, or is more of a form of unconscious bias about which there is emerging social science. It perhaps is a worthwhile conversation, but here's another view I want to offer you. Regardless of whether it is classed as intentional bias, or the bias is a result of something more sublimated and unconscious, the implications for the people that receive the effects of the bias are the same. And where it interacts with the criminal justice system at many levels, the results are the same. And so I don't begrudge anyone who wants to root into and parse the causes of the discrimination. But the magnitude of the challenge that we face is such that we shouldn't get lost in that conversation and lose the forest from the trees. Part of my excitement about the opportunity for change in this area is that there are some left-right coalitions that are emerging. In fact, I don't know if many of you have followed this, but there's so many that are emerging that it's a little annoying. It's kind of difficult to like figure out, it's kind of like a race to be in a left-right coalition. I've received some of these calls myself about participating in them, and I thought to myself that it's something that I should say yes to just to be in that meeting and see how it goes down. It would be fascinating. I could Google what the person said about me before I got to the meeting, and then we could find a happy agreement on a different topic. But more importantly, these partnerships go to show that it's not about big R Republicans or big D Democrats, but about the functioning of our republic and about our democracy itself. The Presidential Commission that Chief Ramsey of Philadelphia and my former Vera board member, Lori Robinson, co-chaired. And I think what they released was an interim report, but it's very lengthy, has a range of recommendations. They pointed to a lot of different things. They included increased community policing, including in immigrant communities, increased training, transparency, accountability, and oversight, increased diversity in law enforcement. All of those things are welcome. I think they're necessary but not sufficient, because certainly there's more to do. But the fight for democracy, as we know and as we reflect on today, it takes many forms. Sometimes it's about voting. Sometimes it's about equal rights for women. Sometimes it's about policing. It didn't end in Montgomery, and it's not going to end here, even if we're at an inflection point. We can work to bend the curve. Many of you probably already are. But in order to do so, I think that we need to turn back to those first principles, the terms under which we agreed to allow police to be in our midst for the purpose of the democracy, to be that close touch with the people, to make people sleep easier and not afraid. The President's task force, to be sure, is on the right track. So too is my colleagues at the Vera Institute for Justice that have looked at some of these issues, particularly in the context of immigrant communities and in collaboration with the DOJ. And they found that focusing on the vulnerable, including those with limited language skills who may otherwise be ignored, such that policing once again supports all members of a democratic society and not just the powerful, training and the community focus is the way to go, and not the we-they formulation. The message we take from Selma and the way in which it relates to our conversation today is that Selma was about perfecting the union, but that the union will not be perfected in a self-executing way. It takes work. I've heard John Lewis say this many times, and he's probably there right now, and he's probably saying this to somebody right now. Congressman Lewis is fond of telling young audiences that you have to be prepared to get in the way of injustice when you see it. That's literally what he says. He says, get in the way. One irony, as I thought about this speech, is that that's probably the exact same thing that motivates young police officers who decide to step forward and serve, right? That in a sense, they want to get in the way of injustice and stand between injustice and the citizenry. So we can have common purpose around that. You all in this room, you have special attributes. You have education, you have skills, you have the opportunity and the power to stand in a special place for equality. You can do the bold things. You can help perfect the democracy. These are the principles that will shape the arc of your career, and what's very important to recognize, and I speak again from personal experience, you can make changes wherever you are. I have served in the private sector, I've served in government, and I've served in a not-for-profit context. And there are opportunities to do things that matter wherever you find yourself. Should you be general counsel of a corporation one day, don't think that you've opted out from contributing to things that matter in this kind of way to a democracy, because the influence that you will have from that vantage point are just as important as the civil rights lawyer who stands in court, the public defender, or the prosecutor. The march in Selma was bold. It was walking up to risks that were known. It's staggering to think about the courage that it must have taken. And I don't know, in some ways it must have been easier to be a young child and not fully appreciate it than to be an older person and know full well what you were going to face. And yet the people did it. People literally bled for the democracy. But today, as I think about it, too many people are bleeding in our democracy, being killed in cities and towns, people in civilian clothes and those in uniform, like officers Lou and Ramos, and in civilian clothes like Garner and Gurley. We need to commit to forging a new path. I have committed my life to justice and to working to narrow the gap between the Constitution's high promises and what are too often low real-world practices. I think bridging that gap is part of the challenge we now face in community policing. I really believe and hope that we can work to make the union more perfect. And I believe that some of you will commit yourself to this cause. Our democracy only works if we engage in it fully. And our nation depends on you joining me and so many others in this cause. Thank you.